Alright guys, so let's jump in straight to the brain part 2 with our lovely image of the surface of the brain right here. So cool. Alright, so here we are going beyond the cerebrum. Again, that cerebrum is kind of the tan outer part. Right here, this is a mass of commissural fibers, that corpus callosum. Right in here is where we're going to look next. This entire area in purple is called the diencephalon. The diencephalon. Another name for it, very, very old name, it's not really a correct term, is the mammalian brain. So the diencephalon is, if you read it in old textbooks, or if you read it about it in popular science books, it's sometimes called the mammalian brain. And the reason why the diencephalon is sometimes called the mammalian brain is because this is where we do a lot of our not very basic life functions, but somewhat higher life functions. Things like sleeping, things like emotion, things like memory. Right, almost all of these are done by these structures in the diencephalon. In green down here, this is often sometimes called the reptilian brain. I just realized I said often sometimes. This is sometimes called the reptilian brain by, again, the same group of people who call this the mammalian brain up here. And this includes some of your lower brain functions like breathing, like heart rate, and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the diencephalon up here. There's only 4 major parts that we are going to learn though. That is the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the pineal gland. The thalamus is right here. Alright, that's this kind of purple egg-shaped part right there. The hypothalamus, hypo means below. It's this entire area below the thalamus. The pituitary gland is right there. It hangs off the hypothalamus. And then the pineal gland is on the back side, the posterior side of the thalamus, right there. So let's take a look at the thalamus first. Notice that the thalamus is right in the center, so it receives information coming in from the brainstem and the spinal cord, and information going out from the cerebrum to the brainstem. Alright, so because it's so centrally located, it's the primary relay station. And it's the area of the brain where most of your sensory information comes through. Everything but smell, actually, in fact. And so everything you feel, everything you touch, everything you see goes first through the thalamus before it reaches, say, your primary visual cortex, your primary auditory cortex, etc. And your thalamus, as it receives this information, it helps to filter out some of the unnecessary stuff, some of the stuff that's slightly repetitive, some of the stuff that maybe isn't as important. Right? So it helps to act as a filter. It also helps you to maintain consciousness by filtering out all the unnecessary things and helping you focus just on those things that are important to you. Now, those things that are important to you may be different from things that are important to another person. A really good example of this is, maybe a mother of a newborn. I was going to say newborn mother, but that wouldn't work. A mother of a newborn child, alright. We've all heard stories of the mother of a newborn child who could sleep through, a jet engine go on over her house. But as soon as her baby starts to make the barest sound of crying, she's up, she's awake. So your thalamus is the one that decides what sort of information reaches the cortex, what sort of information is important, right, that baby's cry, and what sort of information you can safely ignore, such as that jet engine. The thalamus is what also transmits information from your cerebellum, different from the cerebrum. Alright, cerebellum is in the back of the head. And your basal nuclei to your primary motor cortex. We had learned previously that the basal nuclei or basal ganglia is responsible for coordinating movement. Alright, primary motor cortex issues movement. Basal nuclei helps to kind of modify those commands. We'll learn that the cerebellum does much of the same. So your thalamus is where all these 3 structures come together. Now what it's actually made of is multiple nuclei of gray matter. Remember we learned that a nucleus within the brain is a mass of cell bodies, a mass of gray matter. And when we look at the thalamus, I'll come back to the slide in just a second. Again, it's that egg-shaped part. There's 2 halves to it, right? 2 eggs to it. one in each hemisphere. And highlighted in color, here's all of the different nuclei. Each one of those nuclei will receive and transmit different types of information. Not stuff you need to know. Alright, not for this class. But there it is in case you really need help falling asleep tonight. I can bore you. But again, the main take-home here is that just each area of the thalamus receives different types of information or routes out to different areas of the cortex. So your thalamus, if it's working properly, you're normally awake, right? So that might be you right now. Or maybe you're kind of sleepy, okay? So your thalamus, as it starts to restrict some of the information coming through, some of the sensory information coming through, you're feeling more tired and more tired and more tired. Things like alcohol or sedatives will cause your thalamus to restrict information coming in. Part of the reason why alcohol, at least, the first couple drinks makes you tired. After the second couple drinks, well, that goes out the window. It's actually a stimulant in other parts of the brain. If your thalamus is damaged and it can't let things through at all, well, then you slip into a coma. Now, the opposite side of this is maybe you're scared. Maybe your sympathetic nervous system is kicking in, alright? And your sympathetic nervous system releases epinephrine or adrenaline. That triggers what's called elevated alertness. You're really aware of what's going on around you. Caffeine does the same thing. Amphetamines do the same thing, although to a much more extreme extent. Alright. These last two, LSD and psilocybin, they do act on the thalamus, but not in the same way as epinephrine, caffeine, or amphetamines. LSD and psilocybin, we don't know really what they do. I mean, obviously the study of them has been restricted, but we think that they allow for increased cortical activity and increased sensory input through the thalamus. So if you vastly increase your sensory input and vastly increase your cortical activity, you will get hallucinations. So, but hallucinations in coma are abnormal, alright? Mostly we're varying between sleep and elevated alertness with our thalamus. Now, how does the thalamus depress certain sensory input using those inhibitory neurotransmitters? Let's look at the hypothalamus. So again, in our brain, here's our thalamus right in the center. There's our corpus callosum right there. Alright. Here's our hypothalamus, right below the thalamus. And even though it's a tiny little bit of brain tissue, it has a huge job. Your hypothalamus is often called the mind-body link. It links your brain and what's going on in your brain to the rest of your body. So when you think about a test coming up, or when you think about maybe calling that boy or girl you had a crush on, your heart starts to race, right? Well, it's your hypothalamus that's assisting in that control of heart rate. It's what receives information from your limbic system and your cortex, and it's what secretes hormones that make your heart rate increase. So your hypothalamus is the primary control center of your autonomic nervous system. Remember, your autonomic nervous system is all the types of movements that you do not have conscious control over, such as heart rate, such as breathing rate, for the most part. Alright. Such as sweat secretions, such as digestion. Right? Your stomach and your intestines have to squeeze food through. So it's your hypothalamus that controls, at least indirectly, all of these. And your hypothalamus also serves as a relay station between the limbic system and smell and all of these body functions. So again, you think of a particular memory and your heart rate decreases or increases. You think of that same memory, maybe your respiration rate goes up or goes down. Your hypothalamus will also contribute to what I call the bar emotions. So you saunter up to a bar, order a drink, alright, and if you get in a fight, your hypothalamus is contributing to all of those emotions: rage, aggression, pain, pleasure, sexual arousal. Your hypothalamus also helps you sleep, too. So, if you drink too much after that bar, you're going to go to sleep pretty darn hard. There's a neat little mnemonic we can use to remember all this. Sweet hat, so red top to bottom, sweet hat. Sleep and wake. Alright. Endocrine. endocrine is control of all the hormones. Alright, oops. Emotion. We just said the bar emotions, rage, aggression, etc. Temperature. As it turns out, your hypothalamus helps to control your overall body temperature. So when you get a fever, it's called hyperthermia, the opposite of hypothermia. When you get a fever, it's your hypothalamus telling your body to ramp up the temperature. It also helps to control your food intake, how hungry you are. As we just mentioned, it helps to control your autonomic nervous system, and it helps to control how thirsty you are. So, if your hypothalamus is damaged, one of the first symptoms is lack of hunger, lack of thirst, and disrupted sleep cycles. Now, coupled to the hypothalamus, if we zoom in here, here's the hypothalamus, as I said, pretty small. We have a major gland called the pituitary gland. And yeah, I know it kind of looks like a sac. It kind of looks like a testicle sac if you squint. It isn't though. There's two halves to our pituitary gland: the part that's towards the front and the part that's towards the back. The part that's towards the front is called the anterior pituitary. The part that's towards the back is called the posterior pituitary. So both these halves are connected to the hypothalamus, and these halves are what actually secrete hormones. So your hypothalamus is the one that commands, your pituitary gland is the one that listens and does the secretion. So let's take a closer look at your pituitary gland. We're going to do a lot more of this next quarter when we look at all these hormones and what they do. Your pituitary gland is the main gland of your endocrine system. And your endocrine system is what your body uses to send communication molecules all throughout to every single cell. Not all of your cells have neurons linking to them, right? So sometimes you need to, in fact often, you need to use chemical signals to get there instead, to send messages instead. And it's your endocrine system that releases these chemical signals, and it's your hypothalamus that tells your pituitary gland and your endocrine system what to release. When we look at the anterior pituitary, and notice, by the way, and it's a pain in the butt, this image is flipped. So anterior is now on the left side here. Your anterior pituitary is actually made of epithelial tissue. Your anterior pituitary is actually an outgrowth of your nasal epithelia. So part of your nasal epithelia during embryonic development goes up and grows and attaches to the brain, and it releases all of these hormones: adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, and growth hormone. Say those 10 times fast, right? The posterior pituitary is made of neural tissue that is a direct outgrowth of the brain, and it only releases two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And we don't have to memorize these now, but you know it's coming, right? Next quarter, first thing we're going to cover is the endocrine system, and we're going to memorize them then. So I'll say this little mnemonic now, we'll repeat it later. TP flag, just for the anterior pituitary hormones, or goat flap for all of them, including anterior and posterior. So that's our hypothalamus and our pituitary gland. If you don't remember anything else from the brain, remember these two. Alright. Let's look at our pineal gland. Let me remind you where it is first, actually. So again, going back to our image, here's our thalamus in the middle. Here's our hypothalamus, here's our pituitary gland, here's the anterior in front, posterior in the back. Here's our pineal gland right there. So our pineal gland is mostly involved in sleep. And I know you're going, wait a second, we have like a million different brain structures involved in sleep. First we had the thalamus, then we had the hypothalamus, now we have the pineal gland. And yeah, you're right, we do have a lot of stuff here. That's because a lot of stuff helps to contribute to sleep. The pineal gland is number one though. Alright? Whereas the hypothalamus will regulate whether you feel tired and your sleep-wake cycle, when you feel tired and when you feel awake. It's your pineal gland that actually puts you to sleep, that releases the hormones that put you to sleep. Your thalamus, on the other hand, will decrease the sensory information coming in so that you can actually fall asleep and you're not distracted. So your pineal glands, go back to him. The main hormone he produces is called melatonin. It's called Dracula's hormone. Melatonin is what actually puts you to sleep. And melatonin production is influenced by light intensity. So, if you're standing outside and bright sunlight is hitting your eyes will relay information to your hypothalamus. Right? And your eyes not only relay information to your hypothalamus, they also relay information to your primary visual cortex and your occipital lobe as well. So your eyes go lots of different places in your brain. Your hypothalamus is going to secrete inhibitory neurotransmitters to your pineal gland. Notice that your hypothalamus and your pineal gland are pretty close together. Alright, so those inhibitory neurotransmitters don't have to travel very far. And that prevents your pineal gland from making melatonin. Otherwise your pineal gland would run free and make all the melatonin at once. Now, assuming that you have no light hitting your eyes, your hypothalamus is going to stop inhibiting those inhibitory... Let me say that again. Your hypothalamus is going to stop secreting those inhibitory neurotransmitters. There we go. Your pineal gland is now going to go, I'm free. I'm free to make melatonin. And that melatonin is actually going to feed back on the hypothalamus. So it's a feedback cycle here. And it's going to cause your hypothalamus to do things like lower your body temperature, decrease your reaction time, make you tired. So melatonin is really the one that actually kickstarts this entire process. I had somebody ask me one quarter, what happens when my boyfriend falls asleep and he becomes like a giant heater right after he falls asleep? I have no idea. That's your hypothalamus, but don't know what it's doing. Alright. So something that's kind of interesting actually is the type of light that's best at inhibiting the production of melatonin is blue bright light. So the bluer a light is and the brighter it is, the less melatonin you produce. The more warm a light is, so the more orangey, the more yellow, the more reddish a light is, and the dimmer it is, the more melatonin you produce. This is not a simple on-off, yes melatonin, no melatonin. There's gradients of a whole lot, a whole little, somewhere in between. Alright? And that all depends on, it mostly depends on the amount of light that you get. So, one of the things that humans have done is we've come up with artificial light sources. And one of our primary artificial light sources, especially in the past couple of years, has been electronics. And electronics give off a very bright blue light. If you don't believe me, look at somebody who's texting, at night in a car or something like that, because we know everybody freaking texts when they're driving. And guess what? Their face is going to be blue from the reflected light. So what does that do to our sleep-wake cycle? Well, you guessed it, it really screws with it. So a lot of times, if you're having trouble falling asleep, and you tell your doctor, hey, I'm having a lot of trouble falling asleep, your doctor will say, well, stop using the computer, stop looking at phones, stop watching TV for an hour before you go to bed. That's to allow your hypothalamus to produce those inhibitory neurotransmitters and allows your pineal gland to make melatonin. Now the alternate, for those of us who like to stay up late at night, and maybe you're noticing this on my computer screen, I use a program called Flux, and this is totally not scientific. There's no real good research to support this except for, what I've experienced. So do not take this as this is not endorsed scientifically. But I like to use a program called Flux, and what this does is it actually, let me see if I can open it. Yeah. So it actually dims my computer screen. It makes it turn more orange. Let me see if I can get it to, yeah, see, ooh, bright blue. Okay. Much more orange, right? So it actually causes your electronics to become, to match the light cycle, the 24-hour light cycle. You'll notice it matches not only my latitude and longitude as well. So it sort of aligns with sunrise and sunset. I also have something like this on my phone. And for me at least, it really helps reduce eye strain and it helps me go to sleep easier, although it may totally be the placebo effect. So, the program, by the way, in case you're curious, it's called f.lux, and it's free to download and use, and it's worked well for me. Another thing that people may try to help them fall asleep at night is actually melatonin supplements. And you can get these melatonin supplements pretty much everywhere now. Um, Trader Joe's, Costco, any health food store. And what you do is you essentially take a little tab before bedtime, and it's supposed to help you fall asleep and stay asleep. I personally haven't had too much success with that, although I know some people have had huge amounts of success with melatonin supplements. However, it's one of those things that is also not very well studied, so there's no real scientific backing, there's just anecdotal backing. One of the things that has been scientifically studied, however, is this disorder called seasonal affective disorder, SAD, up there. Seasonal affective disorder, guess what? Happens a lot here in Seattle. It's caused by continual low light levels, such as what happens in winter, right about now. This actually was recorded in February. That's, during winter this far north, the sun, I swear it comes up at 9 a.m. and it sets at 4 p.m., right? So you don't get very much sunlight at all, let alone very much sunlight through those continual gray clouds. So what happens is over time, you're producing melatonin at a constant low rate, and you're constantly tired during winter months. You're cold, you feel kind of sluggish. If this happens too often and too consistently, you may start to feel depressed, and that's called seasonal affective disorder. How do you combat seasonal affective disorder? Exercise. Exercise is the best way to do it. And to be honest, how many of us are actually going to exercise every single day during the winter? Well, some of us are. You guys are the healthy ones. The rest of us, we can use a little lamp, a SAD lamp, seasonal affective disorder lamp, and it outputs bright blue light. You're supposed to use it for about 45 minutes a day. I have one. I'm actually one of those weird people who exercise most days, but I also have a little SAD lamp, and it sometimes helps. I feel like, I'm not sure, to be honest. So, there you go. There's my personal experiences. By the way, what's cool? Maybe you guys remember from Bio-160 epigenetics. It's those DNA tags, those methyl tags on the DNA and the acetyl tags on the histones. Alright, that control gene expression. Your sleep-wake cycle and how much melatonin you produce is actually controlled epigenetically. Alright, so that is our diencephalon, that's our thalamus, the relay station, our hypothalamus, the sweet hat, our pituitary gland, the slave of sweet hat, alright, that produces all those hormones, and our pineal gland, the Dracula gland, which produces the Dracula hormone, melatonin. By the way, melatonin is different from melanin. Melanin is the pigment in skin and hair, melatonin is a sleep hormone. Okay, let's go deeper now. Let's look at our brain stem. Do I have a picture? Yes, I do. Cool. So when we look at the brain stem, we can subdivide it into three major parts. The midbrain, and I know you're going, wait, brain stem, midbrain? What? Yeah, I know. We just got a deal. Okay. So midbrain is the first part of our brain stem. Another name for midbrain is called mesencephalon, by the way. Kind of like diencephalon, but mesencephalon, but most people just call it midbrain. A midbrain can be subdivided into these cerebral peduncles. I love that word, peduncles. I don't know why. The substantia nigra, remember that's the part of the brain that produces dopamine for our basal nuclei. The reticular formation, and the corpora quadrigemini. The brainstem also includes the pons and the medulla oblongata. Every time I see that word or say it out loud, I think of that terrible Adam Sandler movie, Waterboy. Medulla oblongata. Anyways, here's our brain again. Okay, up here, this entire area is the diencephalon in green. That's our brain stem. The pons is this big old mass down here. The midbrain is portion right here, and the midbrain surrounds one of our pathways through the ventricles, the cerebral aqueduct. The posterior part of our midbrain is these four little bumps, and we can only see two of them here because we only see one half of the cerebral hemisphere. The top pair of bumps does something slightly different from the bottom pair of bumps, as we'll learn, but altogether they're called the corpora quadrigemini. quad means 4, Gemini means twins, 2 pairs of twins, 4 total bumps. Down here, right above the spinal cord, is the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata. Now, where your medulla oblongata ends and your spinal cord begins is right at that big hole in the base of the skull, the foramen magnum. So it's technically speaking, that's where your brainstem ends and your spinal cord begins. Let's take a look at the midbrain. So again, what structures do we have here? We have the cerebral peduncles. Alright. The cerebral peduncles contain motor tracts. Going down a tract, if we recall, maybe we recall, a tract is a grouping of axons traveling through the central nervous system. So a tract is a group of axons traveling through the central nervous system. And our cerebral peduncles is a collection of motor tracts. Do I have it labeled on here? I don't think it's labeled on here. But it's right around here. Those are your cerebral peduncles. The substantia nigra produces dopamine, as we said before, that black-colored neurotransmitter. That's why the substantia nigra has that nigra. Nigra means black. The reticular formation. This one's a bit of a weird one. The reticular formation is a brain structure found within the midbrain, but it also includes several other brain structures in other regions. And we'll see more about this later. But just to give you an intro, your reticular formation integrates information from your cerebrum, so all of your conscious thought, and your cerebellum. It helps you to control muscles. It helps you to maintain posture. It helps you to route information properly. So a lot more on this whole formation in just a little bit. And then the corpora quadrigemini. Again, corpora quadrigemini, Gemini twin, quadri 4. So this is a set of 4 little mounds, 4 little bumps on the back side of the midbrain. Actually, let me show you a picture here. We can see the corpora quadrigemini. In this image of the brain, the 2 cerebral hemispheres, right here and right here, have been kind of pulled forward a little bit. Here's our cerebellum down here. Alright. Here's our corpora quadrigemini, right there. Again, 4 little bumps. There's the pineal gland right there. So, once in this image, they're pretty clear. And they're quite big. So the top 2 little bumps of the corpora quadrigemini, they're called the superior colliculi. Colliculus for singular, colliculi for plural. The superior colliculi are these 2 big ones right there. And the inferior colliculi are these 2 right here. Oops. Both your superior and inferior colliculi are involved in reflex movements, movements that you do automatically. Right. Your superior colliculi are all about movements of your head. In response to hearing something, or seeing something, or somebody touching you. So the example I like to do here, and we're not in a classroom, but what I would do is I would throw like a marker against the back wall. I wonder if I could do it here. Let me throw out something against my wall. Maybe a pen. Let's try this. Ugh. I don't think that worked. I think all I did was scare my rats. I have pet rats. Anyways. Usually what happens when I do this in class is everybody jumps and they look towards where that marker hit the wall. It's a reflex, right? You don't consciously control it. So these superior colliculi have routes towards the muscles in your neck, in your eyes, and they orient your head towards a loud noise, towards someone touching you suddenly. Right? When someone pokes you, it makes you jump. It makes your head twist towards them. If you see something out of the corner of your eye, these superior colliculi will make your head turn towards that. Alright. The inferior colliculi, on the other hand, these are involved in hearing and auditory reflexes, so making you flinch in response to a loud noise. That's controlled by the inferior colliculi. Making you cover your ears. Alright. You also have a tiny little bone in your ears and those tiny little bones in your ears will actually separate themselves when noises are too loud to keep themselves from being damaged, and it's your inferior colliculi that control that separation. when we see the midbrain, right, here's our midbrain. Right up here in purple, again, here's a diencephalon, here's the two halves of the thalamus, here's the pineal gland. Here's our superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. If we look on this image, superior colliculi, inferior colliculi, pineal gland, we can't see the thalamus in this image because it's overshadowed by these two big cerebral hemispheres. Here's the rest of our midbrain down through here. Alright, and then towards the back, our pons has been cut right here. So you see the edge of the pons being cut, and our medulla oblongata is down here. Okay, we see a little bit of our ventricle just because of the way this has been cut. Our midbrain is the origin of a couple cranial nerves, two pairs of cranial nerves. Here's the most obvious, the trochlear nerve, right here. Your trochlear nerve helps to control the movement of your eyes. And we'll learn where all these cranial nerves come and go when we talk about them. You can see that further down here, that's where most of the rest of our cranial nerves branch off. Cranial nerves are all these yellow ones. And just to give you a quick preview, the cranial nerves mostly go to your face. They relay motor control to your face and send information from your face. So as an example, the facial nerve right here, cranial nerve number 7, he controls the muscles of your face, and your facial nerve is what allows you to smile. So from your midbrain is where a lot of cranial nerves branch off. Looking at the front side, so this is if you're looking at this from your forehead, okay, here's our pons, here's our medulla oblongata, much more obvious. You can see those cranial nerves branching off, and here's our thalamus and our hypothalamus and I don't see our pituitary gland. I think it's been cut off in this image right here. Right. So again, what we're looking at is just a portion of the diencephalon and the brainstem that's kind of been removed from the cerebrum. Alright, so that is our midbrain. We're going to see more on those cerebral peduncles and the reticular formation a little bit later. Let's look at the pons. Alright. So the pons is really a flyover state here. The pons is where a lot of tracts run through. So tracts connecting some of your higher brain centers in the diencephalon and their cerebral cortex with your spinal cord. All those run through the pons. So there's a lot of white matter here. Weirdly enough, recent research suggests that the pons contributes to REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. Don't really know how, just know that it does. And the pons works with your medulla oblongata to help control respiration. Respiration is breathing. Your pons helps to control the transition between breathing in and breathing out. So if you breathe in, right, and then you breathe out, that moment of pause, that second of pause between breathing in and breathing out, that transition between those two is controlled by the pons, we think. One of the main points of interest, though, is this is where we find a lot of our cranial nerves, is in the pons. Let me go back to point those out to you. Here's our pons, right there. And here's our cranial nerves branching out from the pons. There's no rhyme or reason as to which cranial nerves come from which part of the midbrain and brainstem. So you may go, oh, do motor cranial nerves come from the pons and sensory cranial nerves go into the midbrain? Nope. No rhyme or reason. Alright. Now to the medulla oblongata. What does it do? It helps to control our autonomic nervous system. So your medulla oblongata works with your hypothalamus and your pituitary gland both together to control your heart rate, your breathing, right, your coughing, sneezing, gagging, vomiting, salivation, swallowing. Okay, all this stuff that you don't really consciously initiate or control. Now there's a particularly interesting structure in the medulla oblongata called the pyramids. We will learn more about the pyramids when we talk about the pyramidal tracts. The pyramids house motor tracts, and these motor tracts, as we'll learn, are called the corticospinal or pyramidal tracts. And it's here where most of these motor tracts cross over. That word decussate, D-E-C-U-S-S-A-T-E up there, that word decussate means to cross over. So we talked about the right half of your brain controlling the left half of your body, right? Well, here's where that crossing over actually happens. Why that happens, we don't know. But here's where it does. You have a small nucleus in your medulla oblongata, small area of cell bodies called the cardiac center that helps to regulate your heart rate. You have what's called the vasomotor center located next to the cardiac center. That helps to control your blood pressure. So when your arteries are wide open, it's easy to push blood through them. Your blood pressure is fairly low. But when your arteries constrict, when this vasomotor center tells your arteries to tighten up, that increases your blood pressure. So this area helps to control the dilation of your arteries and therefore your blood pressure. This area also contains the medulla oblongata also contains the medullary respiratory center. This helps to control respiration rate. Remember our pons controls the transition between breathing in and breathing out. This controls overall rate. And here's where we find all the centers for, again, coughing, sneezing, gagging, vomiting, salivation. One of the kind of interesting hypotheses, and this is a hypothesis, so be careful, don't run around repeating this to everybody you know. Maybe you guys know that when you vomit, or when you feel like you're about to puke, suddenly you produce a ton of salivation, right? You produce a ton of saliva, I should say. That may be because the salivary centers and the vomiting centers in the medulla oblongata are very closely linked, right? They're very close together. Similarly, we also have a small area in the medulla oblongata that contributes to balance, and that area is also very tightly linked with the vomiting center. So if you're off balance, if you're on a rocking ship on the ocean, that makes you feel nauseous and it makes you puke. So, there you go. Mystery of life solved, right? Now, thankfully, the medulla oblongata is the last part of the brain to succumb to anesthesia. Anesthesia numbs some of the activity in the higher brain centers first, so things like primary motor cortex, primary somatosensory cortex, all those are gone first. It reaches down your diencephalon to the thalamus and causes the thalamus to shut off routing of sensory motor information. But unless that anesthesia is badly administered or you get a huge dose, the medulla oblongata stays awake. It stays active during anesthesia, which is good, because you still want your heart to beat, right? You still gotta breathe. You're still gonna puke during anesthesia. Alright. Your medulla oblongata is where we also find some more cranial nerves as well. So, here they are down here branching off in yellow. Okay, so this next part of the brain is totally separate from the cerebral hemispheres. Let me show you, go back all the way here. Here's our cerebrum. Okay, cerebral cortex is the very outer layer. Here's our diencephalon in purple. Here's our brainstem in green. What we're looking at next is the cerebellum. Right there, the cerebellum. The cerebellum mostly helps to control movement. Alright? Mostly helps to control movement. And your cerebellum has two halves to it, just like your cerebrum does, the right and left cerebellar hemispheres instead of cerebral hemispheres. Your cerebellum is also contralateral, just like your cerebrum. Right half controls left half of your body, left half of the cerebellum controls right half of your body. Your cerebellum, though, has lots and lots and lots of interconnections. And there's a huge amount of white matter in there, and lots of places that white matter is going. In fact, it's so convoluted that we call that distribution of white matter, arbor vitae, stands for tree of life. Do I have a picture? Yeah, here I do. Here's that arbor vitae. In there you can see the trunks and the branches. Your cerebellum is much more interconnected than your cortex. And I should say, not just your cortex, but your cerebral cortex. But your cerebellum still has to project fibers, remember projection fibers, right? Still has to project fibers to other parts of the brain and down to the spinal cord. And the areas of the cerebellum where you project fibers are called the cerebellar peduncles. So to contrast, we had the cerebral peduncles that contain motor tracts from our cerebrum going down. And here we have the cerebellar peduncles that have motor tracts from the cerebellum going down through the brainstem. So what does your cerebellum do? Well, it's kind of like your basal ganglia. It coordinates and fine-tunes your voluntary motor movements. More than that, though, more than just having input on your movements, it also receives information from some of your senses. So your cerebellum is what receives information about the position of your body, all right, about your balance, about where your body parts are located, and it helps you to plan your movement so you don't swing yourself off balance, so you don't knock yourself over, so you don't fall over. So it receives convergent input, remember convergent neural pathways from lecture 7. It receives convergent input from sensory pathways and motor pathways to help you unconsciously plan for your voluntary movement. You don't think about it, the cerebellum working. It also helps to store memory of some previously learned movement patterns. So things like walking, things like getting up from your chair, things like opening your car door. Right? You know where your car door's handle is because of your cerebellum. As we said before, it helps you to stay upright, so it plays a role in equilibrium. And it receives some what's called proprioceptive information from your muscles and joints. We did this exercise in class where I said put your arm behind your back. You know your arm is there even though you're not looking at it, right? That's because your joints and your muscles are sending sensory information to your brain. And they're sending that sensory information to multiple parts of your brain. One part is that primary somatosensory cortex, so you know consciously where your arm is, but you also send information to the cerebellum. So if you put your arm behind your back now, and then use your other arm to reach out for something, you're going to move differently than if you had both arms in front of you. And it's your cerebellum that's receiving that information and modifying your movement. Now, movement is really hard. Any of us who have ever tripped and fallen, we know that. Staying upright is really hard. It's something you have to learn. And in order to do this movement smoothly, you have to perform some really complex math, right? You have to understand physics. And it's your cerebellum that does that. Your cerebellum does calculus like nobody else in the world, right? If only we could access that ability and apply it to math class. So your cerebellum is really, really good at calculating things. And I should say things involved in movement. Now, if you damage your cerebellum, either due to stroke or car accident or something like that, it causes what's called intention tremors. This is the inability to stop and start voluntary movements. So with Parkinson's disease, where we damage the basal ganglia, you had tremors at rest. So even though you were sitting still, your hands or your limbs would shake. With cerebellar damage, with these intention tremors, your hands shake only when you're moving them. And specifically, really only when you're moving at the very beginning and at the very end of those movements. I have some examples of intention tremors here in videos. Before we look at those videos, though, let me kind of walk you through this. So again, our primary motor cortex is the big boss. Right? He's the one that controls voluntary motor movement. And that voluntary motor movement is carried out by skeletal muscles. Your cerebellum and your basal nuclei do have some input, though. Right? Both unconsciously. So your primary motor cortex does have to reach out to your cerebellum and your basal nuclei to receive that input. And all three structures, cerebellum, primary motor cortex, basal nuclei, will communicate with your somatic motor nerves, and your somatic motor nerves will communicate with your skeletal muscles. So, and I know there's a lot going on here. I know the difference between basal nuclei and cerebellum and what it does exactly is probably still a little hazy. That's okay. Right? Don't worry too much about trying to make very exact distinctions between them. We simply haven't gone in enough detail to really be able to fully separate them. You'd have to take a neuroanatomy class to go any further. Now, what can happen in addition to cerebellar damage is what's called cerebellar hypoplasia. Hypoplasia is undergrowth, so you get a small cerebellum. And it happens in people. It also happens in animals. So, now this video is not meant to be sad. Okay, cerebellar hypoplasia, it does not affect your emotions. It doesn't affect your... it affects your quality of life, but you're still able to move. And people and animals who are born with this, they're used to it. So, this was intended to be a funny video. I promise. So if we play this, it's a kitten with cerebellar hypoplasia. Obviously, some issues with movement and coordinating movement. Poor little guy. And as you can see, I've watched some other cat videos. I swear, as soon as you start watching cat videos on the internet, your entire day just goes downhill. You look at... I don't know if you can hear that music. Here's a dog with cerebellar hypoplasia. The happiest little dude, isn't he? But obviously the coordination isn't all there. If you didn't hear that music, I really encourage you to click on this link and listen to it. It's really funny. Alright. So our last major system, our last major region of the brain that we're going to look at right now is the reticular activating system. This is a multimodal association area. So this brings in a lot of different brain structures, mostly to do one thing. It keeps your cortex alert and aroused. When we say aroused, we don't mean sexually aroused, we mean awake. So the two main parts of your reticular activating system is the brainstem, most of the structures of the brainstem, and the thalamus. So what happens is sensory information comes in. All that sensory information has to come in from your peripheral nerves, up through the spinal cord, through the brainstem, to the thalamus, and then finally it reaches the cortex at last. It's your brainstem and thalamus, along with your spinal cord, that decide what information gets through and what information doesn't. Your thalamus, along with your brainstem and spinal cord, is called the reticular activating system. It filters your sensory input, it dampens familiar sensory input, repetitive sensory input, or weak sensory input. I keep using this example in class, but the feel of your clothes on your skin, right? The feel of your butt sitting in the chair, the ache of your butt sitting in the chair. If you're like me and you have a crappy chair. Alright, the feeling of cars driving, the sound of cars driving outside, right? The sound of that airplane overhead. You're not consciously aware of those. They're not hitting your cortex because your reticular activating system is filtering them out. As soon as I point them out, though, that reticular activating system lets them through. One of the ways we think anesthetics work, and this drove me nuts when I first learned this, we actually don't know how anesthetics work. But one of the ways we think they might work is by shutting down the reticular activating system. That prevents any sensory information from reaching the cortex, and that also prevents you from forming memories as well. Right? Usually when you're under anesthesia, you don't remember anything, even a couple minutes before anesthesia. So that's our reticular activating system, and here I will call it quits, because we've been listening for almost 50 minutes and our neurotransmitters are all gone. So thanks for sticking with me, guys.